So this is the brand new 2023 ASUS ROG Zephyrus G16, and when they first announced this earlier this year, I was worried because they completely got rid of what made the G15 so special. It was the fact that it came with an AMD CPU. This was a laptop that had great battery life, but also offered good enough performance for gaming. This year they switched it to Intel, and after reviewing this laptop, I'm not as worried as I was before because it actually keeps some of those things in line. And the way they did this was, instead of giving it a new design because they went with 16x10, they just used the chassis of the 2022 M16. Now from a design standpoint, you've seen this before. In fact, I have the old G15 here. It basically looks the same. You know, the only difference is because it's using that 16x10 aspect ratio, obviously you have a deeper body. It's a little bit heavier now because the body is a bit bigger. You're looking at 4.5 pounds, and then another 1.5 pounds if you decide to carry the 240 watt charger with you. It has those little holes on top, and if you look very closely, you can see some design elements inside of the aluminum alloy lid. The bottom is still plastic, and I really don't like the way the ports are set up on this. All the ports are to the front of the laptop, just like the G15. So if you have all your cables plugged in, it's kind of annoying if you're using a mouse. It just kind of gets in the way sometimes. Now, obviously they had no choice. Like they could have put the vent in front and the ports on the back, but then you'd complain about the vent producing too much hot air. And some of you might say, well, you know what? Put the vents on the back, but there already is. This design is so thin that they just need vents everywhere to keep it cool. Now the port lineup is identical to the G15 with some new advantages. For one, you still have your power connector, which comes with a 240 watt power brick. HDMI port, it's 2.1 instead of 2.0, which you got last year. You have a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet jack, USB-A, 2 Type-C ports. You have one Thunderbolt 4 port. The other one is a regular Type-C port, but it also connects directly to the dedicated GPU. You can also use it to charge, and of course, you can hook up an actual display. And then in the front over here, you have your combo audio jack. On the other side, you have your micro SD card, and then of course, you have your USB-A port. Now, just like the G15, you can easily open it up with one hand. The hinge is pretty good. It's a stiff hinge, not as stiff as, let's say, a MacBook Pro 16, but stiff enough that I don't have any major complaints. Of course, being a G series, you can lie the display nice and flat against the table if you ever need to. Now, I know some of you out there are gonna be like, well, Matt, the fans, they're blowing against the display. It's gonna burn. It's gonna fall off. Well, I mean, look, it's been 2 to 3 years of this style and we haven't had any major issues, so I don't foresee it being a problem in the near future. Keyboard, very comfortable to type on. This is the same keyboard you'd get on the G15 from last year, so no differences there. Of course, you have RGB that you can change to any color you want. Power button on the top right. Trackpad directly center in the middle, which is fantastic. It's a good size, nice and clicky. It works very well. But we do have one big problem, and I haven't seen this since 1992, December 5th. I see 2 NVIDIA stickers. This is not a good thing in the sticker industry. It means the sticker guy is getting paid at least $3 million per laptop to place the stickers on it, and the fact that they're putting 2 NVIDIA stickers on it means Intel is not doing so hot. This is a pure power play move. They know Intel's stock has dropped by placing 2 stickers on the laptop. They're trying to scare them out of the industry. But the display is very identical to the previous model. It's a little bit brighter, but the color gamut is a tiny bit lower compared to last year's G15. It's more than respectable for any sort of design work or watching content on it, and games obviously look fantastic. They obviously kept the same refresh rate of 165 Hertz, which I think is fine. Like, this is a 1920 by 1200, and there's only an RTX 4060 inside of here. You just don't need anything more than that. Now, performance is where things get very interesting, because last year we had a Ryzen 9 6900HS, but this year they stuck an i7 13620H. Now this i7 compared to the regular i7 13700H is pretty much identical when it comes to performance cores, but you only get 4 efficiency cores instead of 8 efficiency cores that you'd get with the 13700H. You pair this with 16 gigabytes of RAM, the 16-inch display, a 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD, and what you have is a CPU that runs very comparable to last year's 6900HS. It may look a bit different when it comes to single core and multi-core performance. Obviously, synthetics show a different tale, but when you're actually using CPU-based applications like Adobe Premiere Pro or Adobe Photoshop, you see that the performance on both of these laptops are almost identical. There's not much of a difference there. The difference comes down to gaming. Because this is using an RTX 4060 at 120 watts, just like the 3060 last year, you do get a performance uplift. Now, to keep things equal, I reduced the resolution from 1920 by 1200 to 1920 1080 to compare it to last year's model. And the performance difference is around anywhere from 10 to 15 frames per second, depending on the game you're playing. Now, granted, if you do decide to game at QHD, that performance difference will be bigger, but because this is a Full HD Plus display, most of you are obviously not going to be doing that unless you're hooking it up to an external monitor. Now, the big difference obviously comes down to DLSS, like this is using the 3rd generation of, and if the game supports it, you're gonna see a bigger difference in frames per second, but there's still not a lot of titles out there that are very popular using that technology. Fan noise is also very similar to last year, like when this is on turbo mode, you're looking at 60 decibels, which is ridiculously loud, but if you put it on performance mode, it'll stay in the lower 50s. And obviously if it's on silent, then it's gonna get down to about 40 to 43 decibels. But interestingly, I found that the R9 6900HS was slightly cooler overall, and that was a hot laptop to begin with. When this thing is completely under load, last year's model was a little bit cooler than the newer version. And because the 6900HS is more efficient, because it's a lower nanometer, it was able to sustain higher clock speeds for much longer than the i7 in this guy. The internals look very familiar to the M16 2022. You have a lot of copper going back and forth to keep the CPU and GPU cooled. You still have one stick of memory soldered onto the motherboard. So depending on the region and the model you buy, it could be either 8 or 16. In this situation, I have 16 gigabytes soldered onto the motherboard, which means I can put another stick of 16 if I want to in here and increase it to 32. You have one drive over here. It's not the fastest drive I've tested, but it's fast enough. And if you want to add a second one, there's an empty slot on the left-hand side. Of course, you have your swappable Wi-Fi 6E card, and then you have your 90 watt-hour battery on the bottom. Now, this is the surprising part. I was expecting last year's AMD model to give me better battery life. I got about 7 hours and 15 minutes last year. This model gave me 10 hours and 26 minutes. So here's the thing. The G16 is $1449. It's not a bad price at all. It's a great price for a mid-range laptop. This is ASUS's new slim mid-range offering before the more expensive M16. But the problem is the G15 has a lot of stock available still. And right now it's being sold for $1250 at Best Buy. If I was you, I would look at that first. Yes, you're not getting an RTX 4060, you're using a 3060, but the performance difference at 1920 by 1080 is not that big. You are getting a QHD display instead of a Full HD one, and you're saving about 200 bucks. Once that goes away, then I would probably scoop a G16 instead because the price point is still good. It's a solid laptop, not much of a CPU upgrade, but it's still a very solid experience. Overall, it's a good product. I would have loved to see this in a chassis that allowed 2 sticks of RAM, but at least the newer M16 has it. If you have any more questions, let me know in the comment section down below. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.